This is the Watchman giving a clarion call. And I saw a bit of news today that I said to myself, I just have to speak to this because it has become a more important story as time has gone on. And in another 10 years, if the trends stay the same as they have been for the last 5 or 6, then this will change the geopolitical balance of monetary powers based on the actions this country is taking. So let's do that for a moment. Let's talk about gold reserves, and we're going to talk about the country that is making all the right moves when it comes to building up their reserves in such a sustained way that they are going to make for themselves a superpower tier gold physical reserve that they actually control themselves. And that country is Russia. Now, I've talked about Russia from time to time with their gold reserves, but I haven't spoken to that in a while. But that doesn't mean that it's gone away. It doesn't mean that they've slowed their stacking. It doesn't mean that they've changed any of the fundamentals that have really been driving their accumulation for the last 5-6 years or so. Today, in the last couple of days, it just came out that the Russian central bank is still adding gold at a very exuberant pace. I think these are the reserves that they added in April, and they added another 600,000 ounces of gold to their reserves, and which is almost 19 tons, just under 20 tons of gold in 1 month. Now, several things come to mind when you hear that figure. If it's a one-off, 20 tons is not that big of a deal, especially a country the size of Russia. But it's not a one-off. Russia has been accumulating gold at a sustained rate. In fact, the rate is sustained, but it has been quickened in the last 3 years to over 200 tons a year, and that is substantial. That is a substantial amount of the world's gold that it supplies through mines each year. And we can safely assume, I think, that the gold that Russia is adding to their reserves is mostly mined in Russia. Now, Russia is one of the largest gold producers. Vladimir Putin is a forward-thinking man, a great leader, a skilled leader, who knows who his enemies are. He knows who Russia's enemies are. These banks, these puppet masters who run them and who try to control Western governments and really all the world's governments through this monetary control. But the way that they maintain the monetary control is by maintaining the illusion that these debt-based currencies and the systems that prop them up are sound and solid. And they maintain that illusion by keeping the price of gold and silver managed, depressed, and rigged through a series of mechanisms. But Putin knows this. Years ago, he sent an economic advisor of his to a GATA conference, and GATA gave a presentation of how London and New York were rigging the gold price, how they did it, why they were doing it, and what effect it had on the monetary system around the world. Well, that economic advisor went back to Putin and spilled the beans on what GATA talked about. And Putin, it made such a profound impression upon Putin that he immediately began accumulating physical gold. Once he understood that the way that they control other countries is by controlling the price of gold, and the way that they control the price of gold is that very few people ever demand physical gold. And Putin realized that he could kill several birds with one stone. Firstly, he could rebuild what used to be a world-class gold reserve back when, in the olden days, when Russia was Christian, when it was an empire, when it had a czar. And in those days, it was thousands of tons of gold. One of the largest reserves on Earth, for many reasons we won't go into right now, but it was one of the largest reserves. But it was drawn down to nearly nothing, just a few hundred tons. Especially, it was raided during the communist era, in the waning of the communist era, when they were selling gold onto the market, old legacy gold to meet demands. They burned down the reserves to nothing. Putin understands that if he is going to rebuild Russia's place on the world stage, if he is going to rebuild them as a world power, he has to rebuild their gold reserves. He knows this. So they have to be substantial relative to their economy and their population, and they have to have it within arm's reach. In other words, they can't store it in New York and London, because if they do, nothing changes. All they'll get is really obligations for gold owed to them by the same people who are trying to destroy them. So it behooves Russia not just to rebuild their gold reserve, but to take the gold that they build part of that reserve from their enemies. And they do this to some extent. Now, most of the gold that they do take is from their mines in Russia. This does several things. This gets them huge quantities of gold under the table so that no one quite knows exactly how much they sourced from the open market. And two, it helps prop up the national gold mining industry of Russia, which in Putin's eyes, I think correctly, is a matter of national security. And Putin's idea of a strong, nationally secure Russia is one that has large, sovereign quantities of gold that it controls and that it sources from within its own substantial borders. So Russia has just added another nearly 20 tons of gold, and that brings Russia's hoard, Russia's reserves, to over 1,900 tons. Well, big deal, Watchman. 1,900 tons is, a fly. It's not really significant at all. Well, if you consider that Russia had just about 400 or 500 tons before Putin got a hold of things, and that he has more than tripled, almost quadrupled their reserves in just a few presidential terms. And if you consider the fact that Vladimir Putin was just elected for another 6-year term, and that he is accumulating over 200 tons per year, well, at this trajectory, at this rate of stacking, of accumulation that Putin is gaining for Russia, by the end of his next presidential term, the Russian Federation would have acquired another 1,200 tons of gold on top of what it has now, which would be well over 3,000, well over 3,100 tons, maybe more, just by buying the amounts of gold they're buying this very moment. And friends, over 3,000 tons of gold would put them within a hair's breadth of Germany itself, which has, I think, about 3,400 tons on paper. Now, I don't think all that gold is actually able to be delivered in a timely fashion, but they have obligations of gold that are basically the second largest on Earth. It is a large gold hoard. And this means that Putin, within 3 presidential terms, would have been successful at restoring Russia's gold reserves to roughly 500 tons of gold to the size of Germany, the second largest hoard on Earth, which would truly be a stupendous feat. And here's what else is interesting. Russia has about 144 million citizens in the Federation, and they have about 61 plus million ounces. So 61 million ounces for 144 million citizens. This means that basically He almost has, the Russian Federation almost has a half an ounce of gold in a bank for every citizen that is in the Federation. That is astounding. That's astounding. There are only a handful of countries on Earth that have larger tonnage gold reserves than Russia. But there are even fewer countries that have, let's say, that amount of gold per citizen. I think Switzerland has more than the 0.4 ounces per citizen that Russia has. And I think on paper the U.S. the U.S. has it in Fort Knox. I'm sorry, I can't stop laughing whenever I talk about the gold reserves of the U.S. government. I like ghost stories and I like fairy tales as much as the next guy, but not when talking about gold reserves. Gold reserves are too important a topic to give any credence to pretend, made-up, baloney figures. And unlike the Fort Knox gold, Russia's gold is all accumulated within the last decade, basically. The last 10 to 12 years. And it's all from domestic mining. And it is all verified. I mean, we know that they're actually doing this. There was a recent cargo plane in Russia that was transporting gold bars. And we can only assume that many of them were meant to head straight to their central bank. But there was an accident on the runway, and several crates were overturned, and the gold bars flew out all over the runway. Like the memes that say, meanwhile in Russia. Well, meanwhile in Russia, a plane is losing a box, and gold bars are flying all over the place. But in all seriousness, Putin is a man with a vision. He wants to restore Russia to a prominent place that was stolen from them 100 years ago. He knows who it was who murdered his people. He knows who it was who stole their gold. He knows who it was who overthrew the old Christian imperial order that was far less dangerous, that was far more benign, that was far more moral. It was a moral government, which is something you cannot say for most of governments in the West today, can you? And Putin wants to restore much of what was lost over the last lost century to the Russian people. And this will be his legacy. One of his greatest legacies will be that he restored Russian gold reserves to one of the largest on Earth per capita and in actual raw tonnage. And he did it without breaking a sweat. I mean, he honestly did. You've got to give that to him. He's been stacking, I wouldn't say slow and steady, but it's not breakneck and steady, but it's up there, and it's been steady. And if he continues this pace, this very healthy pace of accumulation, he will go down as one of the best, not just Russian rulers, but one of the best political rulers, bar none, in the last century, as the world has produced anywhere. And that is saying something, because this is a time of rampant criminality. And when he could have been that type of criminal, that type of person who plundered the national reserves, like a Maduro or a Chavez, Chavez not even did as much as Maduro, but one of these tyrants that just accumulates everything for themselves and leaves nothing for the people. Putin hasn't done that. And it's the reason why his approval rating is like 90% plus. Because he actually cares about his people. I know that sounds like a cliche. I know that sounds like, just emotional sap. But he does. He actually cares about his people. And that's a remarkable thing. And there's few things you can do more for your people long-term as a leader than making sure that they have sovereign wealth that belongs to their people, their state, that is in their own hands. And Putin has done that. And if you look at these numbers, these raw numbers, it sounds like in 2018, Putin is set to easily top 200 tons again. if he just continues roughly at this 20-ton pace that he's doing. And I think we can expect May to be as high as April was or higher next month. Because remember, gold had a big dip. And Russia likes a bargain when it comes to the gold market. They will buy noticeably heavier on dips than when gold is higher. So just think about this. Just think about it's the year 2024. Putin is finishing his fourth term, actually, his fourth term. That's a quarter century serving in office. He's finishing his fourth term, and Russia will have perhaps the second largest gold hoard on Earth. And they will have, hopefully, advanced the relations and repaired relations with the U.S. If we don't get steered into a war needlessly for certain tiny rogue states in the Middle East that try to get us to fight all of their wars. And everyone knows who I'm talking about when I say that. Putin will have bequeathed to Russia much of their glorious past and given them a chance at a future that they can be proud of. That's all that anyone should really expect or demand from their leadership. And I am very encouraged to see this trend continue, and I hope that in the coming months we will see this trend be as it has been the past 4 years, and that we can watch a transfer of power monetarily more and more to Russia and its allies until this process has played itself out. So just keep an eye on this, people. Russia is doing it right. They are not trying to roil the market. They're not trying to spoil the price. Why would they do that? Why would they shoot the goose that laid the golden eggs? If the banksters in London can keep gold at $1,300 for another 4 years or however long, it may not be for very long at all, why would Putin rush the upward valuation when he can get all that gold back to his country for a very low price? So just think about that. It is something that is on our enemies' minds, to be sure. They are afraid of Putin as much as ever, and they know that he knows their weak spot, and he's attacking it over and over. This is the Watchman giving a clarion call. Stay vigilant and bring the fight to them.